Yes, good morning. This is Jim Embry, and I am delighted to join with you all this morning or afternoon in the sorghum harvest workshops and festival there in Maryland. Thank you all so much for inviting me to join you all. And I'm going to go in between this full screen and a PowerPoint with a bunch of images that I hope you all will enjoy, be inspired by, and to take notes from, okay? A lot of information in here today. And again, I'm just so pleased to be a part of this wonderful gathering of harvest time, and especially sorghum, because on my ancestral farms I live on now, sorghum was a big item to be harvested. It meant, a sweetener for all types of things, desserts. It meant sorghum over biscuits. It meant a time to come together as family and work together. It meant a time to be creative and be playful. So again, thank you all so much. I'm going to switch now to a slide share and see if we can't begin today with some images. So again, I want to again thank you all for being part of this wonderful two-day celebration of community, family, harvest, the soil, putting our hands in what we're made from. So thank you so much for being a part of this. I apologize for missing being there present with you all physically, but I'm here with you all, knowing it in my heart. I love you all so very much. And so I'm joining you all virtually. Hope this video comes out well, okay? So to kind of give you an idea of where I'm sitting at, I'm sitting here, we now call Kentucky, which is a bioregion of where I live at. It's a bioregion that includes the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. We are fed by the Kentucky River watershed, and we're nourished by the soil that is heavily mineralized in limestone rock. This was an area that was inhabited originally by many different indigenous peoples. The Cherokee people, the Shawnee people, the Weechee people, all lived in this area that we now call Kentucky. I live in Madison County, Kentucky, on a farm that's about 30 acres. We call it the BALLEW farm. We claimed this land since 1800. That was a year that our ancestral families were brought here from Virginia to what was then called Virginia Commonwealth before it became a state. But we were brought here in 1800, so we claimed this land, this area, since 1800. We were brought here, we worked this land, we loved this land. We were the land caretakers, the stewards of the land. Our blood, our sweat, our tears are in this soil, in this land, and we had babies in the fields of this land. Now, around the year 1889, my great-grandfather and mother purchased this land, and we've been able to keep it in the family since 1800 and 1889. We realize that many African Americans have lost their lands, lost their properties for all kinds of reasons. But we feel very blessed that we've been able to hold on to this land since, again, 1889. Now, I was asked to speak today as the lunchtime keynote about our family legacy. I wrote an essay that's part of this book called We Are Each Other's Harvest. And I'll be speaking and reading from that essay. And throughout the essay, I'll be speaking and writing about this picture here that shows some of my ancestral family that are so important to me. And these are all brothers and sisters who were all young people when the war ended. My great-grandfather was about 4 years old. His sisters were a bit older. That was Harriet and Nanny. And in the middle there is my great-grandfather, Don Carlos Buell. Now, this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, the title of the book comes from a poem by a dear friend of mine named Gwendolyn Brooks. You all, I'm sure, have heard of her. Lived for many years in Chicago, wrote many beautiful books of poetry, was good friends with a whole host of people, including Haki Madhubuti, whose given name back years ago was Don L. Lee. I was blessed to have gone to Chicago numerous times to visit with these dear friends. But this poem that Gwendolyn Brooks wrote is called Paul Robeson, a poem she wrote to celebrate the life, to acknowledge the wonderful legacy, the wonderful creative genius that Paul Robeson represented. So this book title itself comes with all of this family legacy, this ancestral spirit, these ancestral connections, even through the very book itself. Now, here's how I got invited to write an essay in the book. You see Natalie here, it's on my left. And of course, Natalie Brazil is the author of the book, We Are Each Other's Harvest. She's also, as you might recall, the author of the book, Queen Sugar, the book that Oprah Winfrey and Ava DuVernay loved, bought the rights to it, and produced this wonderful TV series. On my right is Melanie Edwards, who's a young farmer up in the Seattle area. I met her in Toronto when I was speaking at the Parliament of World Religions. We met up again in Portland when I was speaking a few months after Toronto at what was called the Biodynamics Association Conference. So Melody introduced me to Natalie and said, hey, Natalie, I met this crazy ass guy named Jim Embry from Kentucky who's got a great story about family that ought to be in your book. So here is my essay entitled Ancestral Vibrations Guide Our Connection to the Land. And I'll be reading a few excerpts from this essay. I hope many of you all have already purchased this book. If you haven't, let me do a shout out commercial for all the different contributions for the book. Most of the essays are written by Natalie. She has a feature on Melanie, and there are numerous other writers in the book as well. You have some poems, you got photographs, and so forth. So please check out Michael Twitty, another dear friend of mine, has a wonderful essay in the book as well. So again, I will read from this essay during my presentation. Now, here's the house that I live in. This house was built in the 40s by my great uncle and aunt, and it sits on, again, on about 30 acres of land. Again, this land goes back, at least in our family ownership, we call it, to 1889. Right across from this house, right across from this farm, is the church that my family helped create even before emancipation. But the structure over there, the building, was built again by my family, who all occupied this area in Madison County called Concord and Moberly, was this rural settlement of Black people. All around us were probably 50, 60 or more Black families that came to the area, especially after the Civil War. Also down the road, no longer there as a structure, was the school that my mother and all of her cousins and other members of the family would go to when they were young. It's also the school that my great-grandfather taught at when he finished up at Berea College. So that's where I live at. This house was built from ammo boxes from the Army Depot where my great uncle worked. Now, let me go back and read a passage from this essay that describes this farm, the image I showed you earlier, and what as a youngster I was able to experience. I grew up experiencing that the great outdoors was our family farms, which contained pastures of crops and animals to tend, fruit orchards and berry patches to pick from, ponds and creeks to swim and fish in, wooded areas and thickets with trees to climb, brambles to get caught in, squirrels, deer, and rabbits to hunt, and at night, darkness with lightning bugs to chase and stars to wish on. We loved being in the country as we called these sacred green spaces with so many Black faces of loved ones. Thank you. Now, as we know, the Civil War began around 1861, and for a couple of years, the North was actually losing the war to the Confederacy. Frederick Douglass had been encouraging President Lincoln to allow Black men in particular and women to fight in the Civil War to gain their freedom. But over the years, after in a position of losing the war, Lincoln relented, and in 1863-64, he opened up with a federal executive order allowing African Americans to enter the war. So here's one of the posters that was around back in those times, encouraging African Americans to join into the war effort. Now, during the Civil War, some 180,000 Black men and women, let's don't forget that Harriet Tubman was a part of what was called the U.S. colored troops. As a matter of fact, numerous Black women disguised themselves as men in order to fight in the Civil War. Now in Kentucky, we had an Army camp called Camp Nelson that was located, it's about 30 miles from where I live now. And in Kentucky, some 28,000 Black men and a few women served and mustered in to fight in the Civil War. But not only were there Civil War troops here at Camp Nelson, also members of your family, your wives, your children, maybe your parents would join you here at Camp Nelson. Now, on my mom's side of the family, we had not one, not two, we had not one, but two great-grandfathers that fought in the Civil War. And we also had one on my dad's side as well. But on my mom's side, we had, again, two great-grandfathers that fought in the Civil War who happened to be brothers. Jackson BALLEW, who fought in the 12th Regiment Heavy Artillery, and his brother George BALLEW. Now, Jackson didn't serve very long. He died in the war within a few months. And he left his wife, Elizabeth, with 7 children. George, however, was part of the 114th Regiment, which is, if you understand some of the Civil War legacy and history, George was at Appomattox when Lee surrendered, because his regiment was part of the other regiments of African-American troops that kicked Lee's butt in Virginia, surrounded him, and forced his surrender to Lee there at Appomattox. After that surrender, in May of 1865, George and his regiment were sent to Texas to defeat and disarm the few remaining Confederate troops that were there in Texas. So some 10,000 Black troops, sailed from probably the East Coast all around to Galveston, Texas, and marched through the city and disarm the Confederacy. That allowed General Granger to come in there a month later in June, and that's what we now call Juneteenth. So, so George Ballew and his regiment also served 2 more years in Texas as part of what we call the Buffalo Soldiers. So it's part of my legacy as a family within the Civil War. Now, here's how the brothers, Jackson and George, might have looked if we actually had a picture. This is not a picture of them, how they might have looked dressed up in all of their Union uniforms. Now, also here's an image of how Jackson and his wife Elizabeth with their kids might have looked if we had a picture. Of course, Jackson and Elizabeth had 7 children. As I mentioned earlier, Jackson died in the Civil War, and he left his wife and their 7 children. Now, it's important to understand that most of the men who enlisted in the Army, most of the Black men who enlisted, who mustered in, if you look at their muster in papers and they write down their occupation, they said farmers. So I call the Civil War this legalized armed insurrection of Black farmers. That's what I call it. Legalized armed insurrection of Black farmers. Now, as farmers, we were asked to come into the Civil War as soldiers, take our weapons, our rifles, and our swords. When the war ended, we literally turned our swords into plowshares, and we returned to the farm from whence many returned to the farm that they had been formerly enslaved in. As we know, many people went north to across the Mason-Dixon line, and many African Americans also went west. There's a great play by Pearl Clegg from Detroit who talks about flying west and the Black folk who went out west to found places like Nicodemus, Kansas. Now, here's an image of how our family, again, my great-grandmother Elizabeth with 7 children, came back to the area of Madison County where she'd been enslaved formerly and began what we call sharecropping. Here's some images of how our folk might have looked in their homes that period, especially after the Civil War. And of course, in the Deep South, it looked very differently than small-scale sharecropping. People were still forced to work these huge fields and to pick cotton. We understand that. We also understand that oftentimes whole communities were built around these large cotton plantations, forcing people back into a kind of like a cycle of never being able to pay off your yearly bill as a sharecropper. We also understand that many men in particular were rounded up and taken to chain gangs. And so post-Civil War meant this imprisonment, oftentimes building roads and working on farms. After the Civil War in Kentucky, My family was also involved in building churches. This church here actually is part of our family. It's called the Pleasant Green Baptist Church, which actually got kind of formed even before emancipation, when one of our ancestors was allowed to create a church for the enslaved people. And this is a church, again, that's part of our family legacy. We also, as we know, post the Civil War, we built churches and we built schools. Here's an image of what we oftentimes hear about, these one-room schoolhouses, maybe with a single teacher, maybe an assistant or two, that taught all grade levels of young people who all thirsty and wanting waiting eagerly to be educated. Now, so here's a image of my ancestors, my great grandparents. These are all siblings. Harriet, Don Carlos, and Nanny were all young people when the Civil War ended. Remember, their father, Jackson, died in the Civil War, and their mother, Elizabeth, had to care for 7 children, and how she was able to survive and thrive, then inspire her children eventually to all own property, and her son, Don Carlos, to go to college in 1879. It's just an amazing experience for me. Now, I mentioned that my great-grandfather, Don Carlos Buell-Ballou, folks called him DB for short. He enrolled at Berea College in 1879. He was there the same year as a guy named James Bond, not 007, but James Bond, who was the grandfather of Julian Bond. They were both at Berea College together. Also at Berea College was another fellow Kentuckian from Madison County named Henry Allen Lane. Henry Allen Lane and my great-grandfather, Don Carlos Buell-Ballou, again, were students at Berea. They were from Madison County. They became fast friends. Both of them taught school because they had gone to college, become school teachers. They were both also small farmers, and they both were fellow collaborators, activists, and organizers of teachers associations and farmer cooperatives for the African-American teachers and farmers there in Madison County. Now, Henry Allen Lane and my great-grandfather, D.B. Ballou, also joined together to form what was back then called the colored Chautauqua, which was an educational experience that was prominent in the United States from the 1800s up to around the 1930s. And so they were the ones who were the organizers of the Chautauqua, a yearly event, usually over a weekend, maybe a 2 or 3 day event. And they held those again here in Richmond for about 20 or 30 some odd years. And over the course of these years of hosting them, they attracted such individuals as Mary Church Terrell, George Washington Carver, H.H. Proctor, W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and so forth. What a legacy! What an experience. Now, as part of their work, as teachers and farmers, they believe that every school ought to have a garden, following in the ideas, if we want to call it, of George Washington Carver. And what they also developed were these associations of teachers and farmers. So they were part of the African American Farmers Cooperative and Teachers Association. These associations, here's just a small representation of their organizing work throughout the county of Madison County. They had 15 farmer clubs that included 230 some odd members. They had 20 homemaker clubs with 500 members. They hosted every year an agricultural fair that attracted 1,000 plus people. They had, over the course of the year, 32 community meetings with 400 people attending. They had 150 plus farms as part of their farmer cooperatives. They had 21 schools in their countywide teacher association. Marvelous organizing abilities, marvelous infrastructure being built post-emancipation, in these counties. Now, they were also part of these national organizations. They were part of the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union. They were part of the National Federation of Colored Farmers. As we know, our dear friends, Jessica Nimhart and her great book, Collective Courage, and our other dear friend, Monica White, who wrote the book, Freedom Farmers, talks about this activism of Black farmers in the South, the work to create cooperatives, the work to create these associations, the work to lay the groundwork, what we tend to call the civil rights movement, was born out of this activism, this work, this thinking of farmers. Now, here is one of those historical posters that would announce these farmers' gatherings, farmers' picnics, and things like that. Now, I mentioned earlier that my great-grandfather and his good friend Henry Allen Lane were the chief organizers, what was called the Colored Chautauqua. I mentioned these two dates, 1915 and 1919, because these two dates are the two dates that where W.B. Du Bois and George Washington Carver both appeared together. In these events, it drew 1,500 people from the city of Richmond, from the nearby Lexington, from Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, and some say also people came in from far away as Cleveland, Ohio. Why? Because the featured speakers were W.E.B. Du Bois and George Washington Carver. Now, 1919, as we remember, is also remembered for another reason. This is what we call Red Summer, 1919. That's where across the United States, some 40, 50 or more Black communities, Black neighborhoods, Black business entertainment districts were literally burned to the ground, and our folk were oftentimes killed and driven out of these communities and cities. Red Summer. And I'm just sometimes sit back in amazement, is that how did my great-grandfather and his other collaborators in 1919 have this event that drew 1,500 Black people to Richmond, and they didn't get shot, they didn't get lynched, they didn't get their homes burned down? How did they do that? That's the subject of another essay. Now, again, I mentioned that the reason why so many folk came to these Chautauquas in those 2 years is because these dear brethren, W.B. Du Bois, George Washington Carver, were the featured speakers. Now, I want to read now, if I can, from my essay that talks about, in preparation for the Chautauqua, they had these reading assignments, which meant you're going to come to the Chautauqua. Before you come, you have to prepare yourself and do these readings. I'm reading now from my essay. According to newspaper accounts, the Chautauqua event drew 1,500 African-American participants and about 20 whites. The featured nationally known speakers included W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Hugh Proctor, and George Washington Carver. The recommended reading list in preparation for the Chautauqua included Black newspapers, Carver's bulletins, books by W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Matthew Henson, and others. That was their reading list. Now, I don't know for the Sorghum Festival if the organizers mentioned, okay, before you all come here now to the farm, let's read these books. But this is an example of how serious, my members of my family and their collaborators, how serious they took these Chautauqua experiences, how serious they took their work to build community after emancipation. Now, here's a picture again of my great-grandfather. Again, we called him D.B. Ballew. And here's an image of his daughter, my grandmother, Paralee Ballew, and her husband, my grandfather, Zach Barnett, and their two children. One was my mother, and then other is her older brother. Again, here's an image of my grandmother, Paralee Ballew, and here's the image again of her family with her husband, my grandfather, Zach, and my mother and her older brother. Hope we all understand when talking about ancestral spirits that my grandmother, when she was carrying my mother, okay, as a fetus, when she was carrying my mother, Jean, my mother, as a 4-month-old fetus, had all the eggs she will ever have. That means that I was inside of my mother as a baby, as a fetus, already as an egg. So my grandmother was carrying my mother and me. My grandmother was probably around her parents, more likely her grandparents, and maybe even her great-grandparents. So when Native Americans talk about what you say, what you do, be careful, because your vibrations of your words and your actions can impact 7 generations. So my work today is because I feel very absolutely, very strongly, very intently that the ancestral spirits of my great-grandparents were felt by me as an egg inside of my mother. Here's my picture of my mother here. She became a nurse later on in her life, probably inspired by her great aunt, Harriet, who was the midwife for this area of Kentucky where we lived at, was the midwife and herbal healer and lived right near where I live now. Here again is a picture of my mother and her grandfather, and she lived with her parents and her grandparents. And she tells the story of how she would ride the bus with her grandfather from their small farm in the city of Richmond on Saturdays to buy a few things for the family. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes the bus would fill with people. And then the next passenger, if that person were white, they got on the bus and the seats were full, the bus driver would point at my mother and her grandfather and say, "Hey, you folks, stand up and give up your seat to the white man here." And my mom would say, Granddad would say, "What did you pay to ride the bus?" Say, "A nickel." And I did too. And we're not giving up our seat. And what happened? They were put off the bus and had to walk the rest of the way into town. So in the 30s, long before, 20 years before the historic Rosa Parks sit down, my mother and her grandfather were refusing to give up the seat on the bus. Later on, because of this activism with her grandfather, my mother became the president of the Congress of Racial Equality in Northern Kentucky around 1959. And then her children, And she was, again, part of this corps founded by James Farmer, a direct action organization that was organized throughout the South and the North and toppled many of the barriers of segregation. So again, here's a picture of my older brother, my sister, and myself. We were much younger, but because my mother was involved with her grandfather and being put off the bus and activism, my mom felt that was quite fine for her children to also be involved with her and my father in CORE in Northern Kentucky. So as a youngster, as a 10-year-old, I was a member of CORE. I was on picket lines. I did wait-ins with my brother. We also integrated lunch counters, as was done in Greensboro and around the South. Also in 1964, I was the state youth chairman for the NAACP youth chapter, and I helped organize the March on Washington and was able to march with Dr. King, Abernathy, and Jackie Robinson, and about 10,000 other people marching on behalf of public accommodations in Kentucky. Later, I went on to the University of Kentucky, and I became the president of the Black Student Union, and BSU's reforms, as we know, are all around the country, and we gave different demands at our universities that changed the landscape of these white institutions. And the issues now at most campuses around diversity, inclusion, and equity are things that we were fighting about 50 years ago. Also, in 1968, a few friends of mine from the university as students went to Dr. King's funeral, and we were serving as what was called funeral marshals. We were in front of the mule-drawn wagon wearing white armband to kind of keep the crowd back so we could move through carrying Dr. King in the mule-drawn wagon. Later on, after attending Dr. King's funeral, where I met Ernie Green, I met so many people, A. Philip Randolph, and so forth, and worked for that summer in New York City. That's where I got introduced to this concept of food justice, maybe food injustice, food apartheid, food sovereignty, which then allowed me then to broaden the scope of civil rights and social justice to include what we call food justice and environmental justice. I also met Dick Gregory in 1971. He put his foot in my behind in all kinds of ways. And I also, in 72, met up with 15 other people there in Lexington, Kentucky, and formed the Good Foods Co-op. We're still around. We have now about 8,000 owners, and we do about $15 million a year in business. In 74, while still in college, I met Jimmy and Grace Boggs and joined in with their political organizations headquartered in Detroit. Many years after that, I became the president of the Boggs Center Board. And then I was encouraged to move to Detroit to become the executive director of the Boggs Center. And I was there about 5 years. While I was there, I had this almost every week experience of working at the Catherine Ferguson Academy. Used to be a school in Detroit. It's closed now for teen mothers who had a working farm around their school. This film called Growing in Detroit is available online. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go online and look at this wonderful, wonderful documentary called Grown in Detroit. Again, this school in the middle here is a good friend of mine who's the principal, Zenith Andrews. Many of the things going on now in Detroit that we know are part of the Black farmers and agricultural work, Black cooperatives in Detroit. We know about our work of our dear friend Malik Yakini and many of his other collaborators. But the work going on now in Detroit around urban agriculture had its inspiration, part of its foundation at this school, again called the Catherine Ferguson Academy, where the young women there raised horses, they had cows, they had goats, they had chickens, they had bees. You see what I'm here, milking a goat. They built their own barn. While I was there, I gave a tour to many people, including the Nobel Peace Committee, who gave them money to put on the barn, a windmill, and a solar collector. While I was there, again, I was very blessed to give tours to a whole host of people from around the world, including my good friend Danny Glover, and you see here below Ossie Davis. It was an incredible time there for 5 years working with the school for teen moms. I got involved in 2008 with the slow food movement. When I went to Italy for the first time in 2008 for the big Terra Madre gathering, my my auntie asked me, she says, well, Jimmy, like you're going to Italy, this thing called slow food. And she said, well, what is slow food? I said, Aunt Bessie, what slow food is what you all have been doing your whole lives and what our people were doing here in Kentucky during our whole time of being in Kentucky. Slow food, meaning raising food on your garden, sharing the food, farming basically organically, making quilts together, long meals, loving family, sharing sharing the bounty. I said, it's what slow food is about. So this slow food movement is an extension of what we were doing our whole lives. But I had a chance to go to slow food and be a part of this international network. I was in China 2017 as a USA delegate for the Slow Food International Congress. In 2008, I was also asked to serve as a co-writer for this book, Sustainable World Source Book. The image there is one of mine from Muir Woods in California, trying to highlight that these trees that are some 2,500 years old have a wisdom, have a knowledge, and we should be like George Washington Carver would do. He would go out in the mornings, he said, before daybreak, talk to the plants, talk to the trees, talk to the fungi, and ask them to reveal their secrets to him. He would then come into the laboratory and execute what the plants and trees told him. So part of our work is to regain this sensibility of communication with the natural world. Now, these are all these wonderful, inspiring, challenging books that many of my friends have written. Farming While Black, Leah Penniman, Freedom Farmers, Effective Courage, Color Food, Natasha Bowen's Land Justice, and we call it now the Harvest book. I trust all of you all have these books, in your library. Now, on my in-law side, my wife's family is called the Martin family, and they're down in West Kentucky. Now, these jokers own a farm now that's about 900 acres. But again, in a similar way, this land, they began to purchase the land soon after emancipation, and then were able to collectively, with different families, buy land that was contiguous to each other. And eventually we incorporated the entire properties of about four different members of our family together. And now it's about 900 acres. This book just came out about a year ago that describes the Martin family legacy, which is very similar to our legacy as the BALLEW Broadus family. Now, I'm also reading, and I recommend it, is this marvelous book, The Disordered Cosmos, written by this sister, Chandra Prescott Weinstein. She's a Black feminist astrophysicist. She studies the universe, the cosmos, way out there, okay? But she is able to take her sense of quantum science, quantum mechanics and relate it right back to our work on the ground. She talks about science not being neutral, but being racist, being sexist. And she provides a kind of like, a pathway of how we can deconstruct not only science, but institutions and apply them to our work on the ground. So I recommend the sort of cosmos. I have an essay on the website called Humans in Nature that sits next to hers. I just feel blessed to even share the same website blog page along with this wonderful, fantastic sister. Now, in closing, part of our work in my mind is to get our children, our adults, our communities to channel George Washington Carver. Now, we recognize that there have been many, many people along the way who've paved the way around this thinking about and practice of regenerative farming methods. Many people. However, I just think that George Washington Carver and his almost 50 years of legacy at Tuskegee University is so profound, so important. He was saying things in the 1890s, doing things in the 1890s that we're talking about doing now. So again, part of the blessing of him, his works, his books, his articles, his speeches are still available, and we should be remembering, rediscovering the life legacy of George Washington Carver. I feel very honored to write about him and lift up his works. So part of our work, even here at the Harvest Festival and our conferences, our meetings, our reaching out to community is still this reenacting what was called the Jessup wagon that Carver developed with Booker T. Washington, where first of all, horse-drawn carriages and now a motorized vehicle went throughout the South, educating people, lifting up, if you will, the Black souls in the South, while also trying to regenerate the Black soils in the South. That it's still our work of trying to find ways to reinvigorate, to reenact these Jessup wagons that Carver and Booker T developed and gifted to us. Now, in closing, I want to close out with another reading from my essay. Now, we see here this image, as we know, of the Penniman sisters, Leah and Naima, holding their hoes, showing this idea of returning to the land, reconnecting with the land. So they're believers that these ancestral spirits guide us. What a wonderful, wonderful image that symbolizes how, all of our people, whatever we're doing, need to grow something, need to reconnect with the land, the soil which we are made from. So I'm going to close out with a last reading from my essay. As the seeds of our ancestors' dreams, we have germinated, have become trees that produce fruit, which is nourishment for the present and will provide the seeds for those who are on their way. Our dreams then will also become the seeds for future generations. This work of reclaiming our sacred connections to the soil, which we are made of, to the air and water that replenishes us, and to the plants and animals that are family, is a quest much bigger than a single country or continent. But it is a journey that will provide a leap in the development and the evolution of humans as a species. This journey begins anew every single day. So I want to read that once again in the full screen. It might have, some things are fine to be repeated. As the seeds of our ancestors' dreams, we have germinated, have become trees that produce fruit, which is nourishment for the present and will provide the seeds for those who are on their way. Our dreams then also become the seeds for future generations. This work of reclaiming our sacred connections to the soil from which we are made, to the air and water that replenishes us, and to the plants and animals that are family, is a quest much bigger than a single country or continent. But it is a journey that will provide a leap in development in the evolution of humans as a species. This journey begins anew every single day. Thank you. God bless you all. Love you all so very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share these words with you.